You won't believe what happened when a simple home renovation turned into a nightmare with my crazy neighbor. But before we dive in, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. It all started the moment I decided to renovate my house, a property I had recently purchased in a quiet suburban neighborhood. After months of searching, I found the perfect fixer-upper, nestled in a calm cul-de-sac. The house had potential, great bones, spacious yard, and the kind of character that could be restored into something beautiful. I envisioned a home where I could settle in, raise a family, and make countless memories. But what I didn't anticipate was the drama that would unfold from my decision to renovate. The first sign of trouble came a few days after construction began. I noticed a woman standing across the street, staring at the house. She didn't look like anyone from the neighborhood, so I approached her, thinking she was simply a curious neighbor. She introduced herself as Karen and immediately began talking about the renovations I was doing. At first, she seemed friendly enough, but there was a sharp edge to her tone that I couldn't quite place. She began to tell me that the renovations I was making were illegal because the construction was, in her words, encroaching on her property. I was puzzled. My architect had carefully reviewed the property lines with me, and I had made sure everything was within the legal boundaries. I assured her that I had no intention of causing trouble or infringing on anyone's space. But Karen wasn't convinced. She told me that I should check again, suggesting that I didn't know what I was doing and that she would be keeping an eye on things. I shrugged it off at the time, thinking that maybe she was just one of those overly cautious types, a stickler for rules. However, it wasn't long before Karen's complaints started to escalate. Each day as the renovation progressed, Karen became more vocal and more insistent that I was violating her property rights. She would stand at the edge of her yard and glare at the construction crew, sometimes making snide remarks. When I asked the workers if there was any trouble, they would just shake their heads, as if this was becoming a regular occurrence. But it wasn't just her comments that bothered me. It was her increasingly hostile behavior. One afternoon, she marched onto my property with a piece of paper in her hand, looking like she had just won some legal battle. She told me she had consulted a lawyer and that the boundary line was in fact much further than I thought. This was the first time I had heard about any legal action being taken. I asked to see the paper she was holding, but Karen refused. She insisted that it was proof of my encroachment and that I needed to stop my renovations immediately. I was getting frustrated at this point. I explained to her that I had hired a professional surveyor and all of the paperwork, permits, and plans had been carefully checked and approved. But Karen wasn't having it. She started spouting off about how she was protecting her rights and how I was stealing from her. She even started talking about an obscure zoning law in the area that I had never heard of before. The entire conversation was becoming more and more nonsensical, and I realized that no matter how much I tried to explain, she wasn't going to listen to reason. Days went by, and Karen's interference only grew more frequent and intense. I would wake up in the morning to find her standing by the fence, glaring at the workers, or sitting in her car, watching every move we made. It was like having a shadow, except it was one that was constantly angry and suspicious. She would yell at my crew if they were on what she considered to be her land, and it became clear that she was trying to create an atmosphere of intimidation. I was starting to feel like I was living in a nightmare. My workers started getting uncomfortable, and I couldn't blame them. Every time they showed up to work, Karen would be there, standing in her yard, fuming with anger. At one point, I decided to go over to her house and talk to her in person. Maybe I could diffuse the situation, clear up any misunderstandings. So, one evening after work, I walked across the street to her property. As I approached her front door, I could already hear her yelling at someone inside, and I hesitated. But I knocked anyway, and Karen answered with a look of pure contempt. Before I could even get a word in, she began yelling at me, accusing me of ruining her life and disrespecting her property. I tried to remain calm, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. I explained once more that I had followed the law and that my renovations were within the legal boundaries. I told her I had the proper documentation to prove it, and that I didn't want to cause any problems for her or anyone else in the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't interested in listening. She was too focused on her own version of events, and I quickly realized that there was no way I was going to be able to talk sense into her. As I started to walk away, she shouted after me, threatening to call the police. I froze for a moment, confused by the sudden escalation. But before I could respond, she slammed the door in my face. The situation only worsened after that. Karen began showing up at the house, unannounced, every day. She would stand in her yard, arms crossed, watching my workers like a hawk. At times, she would get into shouting matches with them, accusing them of being criminals for working on stolen land. My workers were getting scared, and I couldn't blame them. They didn't want to deal with the constant hostility and threats. The project was becoming more difficult to manage, and I was at my wit's end. I knew I had to find a way to make things stop, but every time I thought we had a breakthrough, Karen would find a new way to escalate the situation. I tried to ignore her at first, hoping that she would tire of the drama. But instead, it just kept getting worse. I began to feel like I couldn't go a single day without her interfering in some way. I was starting to feel trapped, unable to focus on my renovation or anything else. I had never dealt with a neighbor like Karen before, and I was beginning to regret my decision to renovate this house. I reached out to a lawyer just to make sure I was in the clear, but Karen's harassment continued unabated. I started to dread going to the property. What should have been an exciting, positive experience was turning into a nightmare. Karen's constant presence and illegal threats were hanging over my head like a dark cloud. At one point, she even put up a no trespassing sign on her property, though I never set foot on her land. It seemed like everything I did only fueled her fire. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Something far worse was on the horizon, and Karen was about to cross a line that no one could have predicted. As the weeks passed, it became increasingly clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. What had started as a simple dispute over property lines was turning into a personal vendetta. Every attempt I made to reason with her seemed to make things worse, and the tension between us began to grow to a boiling point. I had tried speaking to her calmly on multiple occasions, offering to sit down and resolve the issue, but each time she responded with hostility and accusations. It felt like she was out to make my life as difficult as possible, and there was no compromise in sight. By this point, the renovations had been halted several times due to Karen's constant interference. My workers were getting more and more frustrated, but they needed their jobs, so they kept showing up each day, hoping the situation would de-escalate. But it didn't. Karen had become a daily presence at the property, constantly watching and scrutinizing everything that happened. She would sit on her porch, glaring at us through the windows, or stand on her balcony, arms crossed, with a look of pure disdain. She didn't even try to hide her disapproval anymore. One day, I was outside with the contractor, discussing some changes to the design, when Karen suddenly appeared at the front gate. She was holding a camera in her hand, taking pictures of the workers, the vehicles, the entire scene. I asked her what she was doing, but she didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, she snapped more pictures, muttering under her breath about legal action and getting the police involved. At first, I thought it was just another empty threat, but I soon realized that Karen was starting to become fixated on the idea of winning this fight, whatever the cost. The next day, I found a formal letter from her lawyer slipped under my door. The letter accused me of illegally trespassing and violating property rights, demanding that I cease all construction immediately. I had the legal documents to prove that I was within my rights, so I wasn't too worried at first. However, the letter was just the beginning. Karen began making more direct threats, calling me at all hours of the day and night, ranting about how I was ruining the neighborhood and that she would never let me get away with it. At first, I tried to ignore the phone calls, but it became nearly impossible. She would leave long, rambling messages on my voicemail, filled with rage and wild accusations. I had no idea what she hoped to achieve with all this. She wasn't going to scare me into backing down, but she kept pushing harder and harder, and her behavior became even more erratic. It wasn't just the phone calls and letters anymore. Karen began to take matters into her own hands. One afternoon, I was outside with my workers when I heard a loud crash from the back of the property. I rushed around the side of the house to find Karen standing there, furiously shaking a crowbar at one of my workers. She had apparently decided that the fence I had put up, marking the boundary of my property, was too close to her land, so she started to tear it down. I was livid, This was not only illegal, but incredibly dangerous. I shouted at her to stop, but Karen just laughed and continued ripping apart the fence. My worker was trying to calm her down, but Karen was completely out of control, ranting about how I was taking over her land. In that moment, I realized that Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a serious threat. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, Karen had already left. When the officers questioned me, they seemed to dismiss the whole thing, chalking it up to a neighborhood dispute. They took down the details, but nothing ever came of it. The lack of support from the police only fueled Karen's confidence. She felt untouchable, like there were no real consequences for her actions. At this point, I had started to consider moving forward with a restraining order. I contacted my lawyer and began exploring legal options, hoping that would finally put an end to the madness. But before anything could be done, Karen escalated things even further. One evening, as I was finishing up for the day and heading back into the house, I heard a car screech to a halt in front of my driveway. I turned to see Karen's vehicle parked across my driveway, blocking my car in. Before I could even approach her, she stepped out of her car, her eyes wild and filled with fury. She was holding something in her hand, but I didn't immediately recognize what it was. "Stay off my property," she screamed, her voice shrill and high-pitched. I was stunned, frozen in place for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Karen was standing there, her body shaking with rage. I tried to stay calm, asking her what was going on, but Karen wasn't listening. She walked toward me, and that's when I saw the gun in her hand. She was holding it with both hands, and the barrel was pointed straight at me. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I had no idea what had just happened or how we had reached this point. I had known that Karen was becoming increasingly unstable, but I never thought it would go this far. "Get off my land," she shouted again, this time with a crazed look in her eyes. The gun wavered slightly in her hands, but she didn't lower it. I could tell that she was unraveling, and I knew that anything I did could set her off even further. I slowly took a step back, trying to keep calm. My mind raced, and I struggled to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to escalate the situation, but I had no idea how to defuse it either. I took another step back, raising my hands in a non-threatening manner. "Karen, please," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "This isn't the way to solve this. You're scaring me. Just put the gun down, and we can talk about this." But Karen wasn't listening. She was beyond reason at this point. She started ranting about how I had no respect for her and how I was stealing from her. Every word she spoke was full of anger and paranoia, and it was clear that she was no longer in control of her actions. Just then, I heard the sound of sirens approaching, and I realized that help was finally on the way. But before I could make another move, Karen quickly turned and ran back to her car, disappearing down the street. The police arrived moments later, and I told them everything that had happened. They seemed to take the situation seriously this time, but the damage had already been done. I was shaken to my core, and I knew that things were only going to get worse from here. What had started as a simple neighborhood dispute had escalated into something far more dangerous, and I had no idea where it would end. After the terrifying incident with Karen pulling a gun on me, I realized just how out of control things had become. I couldn't believe that something as simple as a house renovation had spiraled into a dangerous and life-threatening situation. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if Karen would show up again, or worse, if she would escalate the situation even further. The police had taken my statement, and while they assured me they would be investigating, I didn't have much faith that they could do anything to stop her. Karen seemed to have some kind of power over the neighborhood, an ability to manipulate situations and bend the rules to her advantage. The next few days were tense. I didn't want to go near the house for fear that Karen would show up again, but I also knew I had to finish the renovation. I couldn't let her win. As I tried to go about my daily routine, I kept thinking about the gun she had pointed at me. The image of it, the fear I felt, kept replaying in my mind, and I struggled to push past the trauma. But the more I tried to ignore the problem, the more it seemed to consume me. It became clear that I needed a more aggressive approach. This wasn't just about property lines or renovations anymore. It was about protecting my safety, my workers, and my right to live in peace in my own home. That's when I decided to take legal action. I met with a lawyer and started the process of filing for a restraining order. The legal steps felt empowering, like I was finally taking control of the situation, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wouldn't just roll over and accept defeat. Sure enough, things took another turn for the worse. A week after I filed for the restraining order, I returned to my house in the evening, feeling exhausted from a long day of work. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the front steps of my house, was a large, homemade sign that read, "Stay OFF my property. I will fight you." It was the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who had completely lost touch with reality. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I slowly got out of my car. Was she really going to continue this madness? My first instinct was to go inside and lock the door, but then I remembered that I needed to call the police again. Just as I was about to pick up my phone, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and found Karen standing there, watching me from the sidewalk. "You think you could just go to the court and get your way?" She spat, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to stay calm. I could see the crazed look in her eyes. Her hands were shaking, and she was holding something in her pocket. For a split second, I thought she might have the gun again, but I quickly realized it was something else. She was holding a stack of papers in her hand, and it looked like she was about to throw them at me. "What are those?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward. "These are the papers that prove you're wrong. I have the right to stop this. I won't let you destroy my life." I could barely process what she was saying. The woman was completely delusional. I had every legal right to be renovating my house. I had proof of the property line, permits, and everything else. But Karen was so consumed by her obsession that she had convinced herself that I was the one in the wrong. I took a step back, realizing that I couldn't reason with her. She wasn't listening to logic, and the situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. I didn't want to provoke her, but I knew I had to de-escalate things somehow. "Karen, you need to stop," I said softly, trying to speak as calmly as possible. "This is going too far. We're not getting anywhere with this. Please, just leave it alone." But instead of leaving, Karen took another step toward me, her eyes wild with rage. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my fight now. You're the one who started this. You don't get to just walk away like nothing happened." That's when I knew the confrontation was inevitable. She wasn't going to back down, and I couldn't keep walking on eggshells around her forever. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone to call the police. But just as I was about to dial, Karen lunged at me, shoving me backward onto the porch steps. I stumbled, and my heart raced with fear. Was she about to hurt me? I quickly regained my balance, but Karen was already on top of me, screaming in my face. "You think you could just have everything you want? I'm not going to let you destroy me." It was like she had snapped completely. The person I had been trying to reason with had disappeared, and in her place was someone unrecognizable, someone capable of anything. I didn't know how to handle the situation, but I knew I had to get away from her before things got worse. Without thinking, I ran inside the house and slammed the door behind me, locking it quickly. Karen pounded on the door, shouting obscenities, but I wasn't going to open it. I called 911, my hands shaking as I explained what had just happened. The dispatcher assured me they were sending officers to the house right away. Minutes later, the police arrived, and Karen was still standing on my porch, her hands balled into fists, shaking with anger. The officers immediately stepped between us, and Karen began ranting about how I was trespassing on her land, how I had violated her rights, how I was the one who had caused all of this. But it was clear to the officers that Karen was the one who had crossed the line this time. They spoke to her briefly, and then told her to leave the premises. As they escorted Karen off my property, one of the officers turned to me and said, "This has gone far enough. We'll make sure she doesn't come back here again. We'll take care of it." With the police finally stepping in, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Karen was arrested for harassment and for the attempted assault during our previous confrontation. The restraining order was granted that same day, and it seemed like, after months of torment, the nightmare was finally over. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. but I also knew that I would never forget what had happened. The experience had changed me in ways I couldn't even describe. What should have been a simple home renovation turned into a terrifying ordeal that nearly ruined my life. But in the end, I was able to regain control of my property, my safety, and my peace of mind.